Hello, and welcome to another episode of This Week in Plymouth. I'm your host, Town Manager Derek Brindisi, and this week we have a special guest, Steve Cole, the Executive Director of the Plymouth Regional Economic Development Foundation. Hi, Steve. How's it going?
Pretty okay, thanks. How are you?
Good. So, Steve, I know we'll just jump right into it. I know you've been in this set, with a number of our state delegates, but this time I thought it'd be really important to have you come in because I know there's a lot of things that are happening at the foundation right now. So it's really good to talk about those items, promote those items, so folks in the community understand what you guys are doing. So just for the folks that have never heard you speak, could you give a little bit of background of the foundation itself?
Sure, I'd be glad to. The foundation is about 20 years old, and we've only recently adopted the shorthand, the foundation, because Plymouth Regional Economic Development Foundation, Inc. is kind of a lot to say, and it doesn't fit on a Twitter handle. So we simply go by the Plymouth Foundation or the Economic Development Foundation. But we have 13 board members, 3 of whom are town representatives, yourself. Thank you so much for your service.
Sure.
The chairperson of the select board, or her proxy. In this case, it's actually Dick Quintal, and the town planner, or rather the director of planning and development, who is Lee Hartman. And I have to say, knowing that those are the 3 that will watch this broadcast, they're my 3 favorite board members. But we also have Matt Moratori, America's very own Matt Moratori, Plymouth First District. He's on the board also. Amy Naples from the Chamber of Commerce. And I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention our executive team, who is Bill Hallisey from Shiretown Glass. He's our board president. Jay Kimball from Wood Seafood is our vice president. We have, of course, the famous Eddie Santos, who created the industrial park here in Plymouth all those years ago.
Yeah.
He's our clerk. And then, of course, we have Bill Harris from WH Cornerstone as our treasurer, and Kevin O'Reilly, who is famous for having worked for Therese Murray and a handful of other folks prior to running the Chamber of Commerce. He now runs Triple M, so that rounds out our executive team. But we have 13 board members. I like to joke that Jesus did a little bit more with just a little bit less. But we have a good team that represents a good cross-section of education, finance, government, education, if I hadn't mentioned that.
Yeah. Great. So that gives a little bit of background of the foundation itself and nonprofit 501c3, correct?
That's right, yep.
Located right on Court Street?
Right on Court Street next to Town Hall. And I should say also that I've worked for 20 years now in this industry as in economic development. And there are different models. Sometimes an EDC, which is what we are, the Economic Development Corporation. Sometimes it's part of the public sector and it's a department within a town. Not a lot of towns actually have that function here. And so when the foundation was created, it was intended to fill that critical gap so that other towns who don't have a director of economic development can rely on the EDC. And that's what we are. We are the region's EDC. We are located next to Town Hall in Plymouth. But we're not just working in Plymouth. In fact, we just finished a product with the Carver Redevelopment Authority at their last town meeting in April to help them get a number of articles approved so that we could help facilitate the development in their urban renewal area.
Wow, that's great. So, Steve, it's interesting because when I worked here as the assistant town manager back in 2015, 2017, your predecessor, Jess Casey, she was doing a number of other things that are very different than what you're doing today, and that's less than 5, 6, 7 years later. So I know one of the items we've talked a lot about at board meetings are the focus areas of the foundations. Can you describe some of those focus areas? Because they're very different than what Jess Casey was working on in the past.
Oh, sure, yeah, and in deference to any predecessor, economic development is something different for every community. Okay. I mean, bottom line, it's about enhancing quality of life. Economics concerns itself with managing scarce resources or assets. Economic development is managing those resources or assets in a way that has a targeted outcome with the express purpose of enhancing quality of life. And one of the things I have to say about Plymouth, it's not necessarily something that we work on at the foundation level, but conservation is an important part of our quality of life. It's one of the things that drew a lot of people to this area, even before the power plant was built. I grew up on the other side of the bridge. I endearingly refer to this area as continental Cape Cod and Cape Classic as peninsular Cape Cod. But the fact is, it's a similar ecosystem. Cranberry bogs and heavily forested areas, great place to go running. And that's one of the things that drew me back here after I left a number of years ago. I left to go to undergraduate at Westfield State, spent some time in Hartford, and then ultimately I came back here because, frankly, I remembered the quality of life that it offered. So with that said, in deference to my predecessors, I believe that after 20 years doing this in 5 communities in 2 states, economic development or projects for economic development fall in one or more of these 5 categories. And they are my favorite, entrepreneurship, small business development, workforce development, what I call MECA, marketing, events, and cultural assets. And then lastly, land use. Land use is largely something that's taking an underutilized piece of land and then getting it developed, but it's also sometimes working with the town manager's office or the town meeting members to change the zoning for a piece of land too, so that it can become more valuable or more attractive to a certain type of development that we want to see here. So those 5 areas are kind of the areas that we focus on here. We don't necessarily focus on housing because there's so many other people working on housing issues. We know it's an urgent issue here in Plymouth County. But frankly, one of the things that I pride myself on with running the foundation, the way we run it now, is we want to focus on issues that no one else is working on, because there's a critical need for it, or there isn't enough staffing for it, or frankly, it's just an innovative idea that hasn't yet been tested. So that's kind of what I feel like I bring to this role.
Right, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those, those new ideas, those new initiatives that you're working on. But before we do, you just mentioned one of the focus areas is really to understand our current zoning and then make adjustments as necessary. And Lee Hartman, as you pointed out, who not only sits on the board but is our planning director, he's advancing 2 articles at the October 15th fall town meeting around zoning. Are you familiar with those 2 articles and what they're geared towards doing? Have you had a chance to look at those?
Lee and I work closely together, and his intent in proposing these is so that it makes it opens up some land for other more precious types of developments by making it more available in other parts of town where we already see it. One example is a boatyard. Typically not allowed at the airport. There are some allowed there, however, with a variance, and he just wants to make something like that allowed by rights.
Right.
And then what was the other?
The other one was where we, looking at the existing commercial industrial zones and having the ability to have multiple buildings on that same footprint.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, look, is there anything more capitalist than allowing 2 types of uses in one space? This is a similar argument that I had when I was town planner in Carver, when we were allowing dual-use solar arrays on the bogs. I mean, not only did that save the industry, but it also helped balance our grid. So doing 2 things on one piece of land, I think, is probably the most American or capitalist thing you could possibly do, as long as it's consistent with the values that we have here in town.
And it's just odd, though, when you look at these, to you and I, we think they're like these simple zoning articles, simple changes. Like you pointed out, how come we can't have a boatyard in the airport area? How come we can't have this district repair boats? Right? These are simple, non-intrusive types of uses that are prohibited today. So, I think just looking at what we've been doing over the last 10 years and trying to understand whether or not it's working and then making those adjustments, really, I'll be honest with you, it's kind of been my first 6 months here, just kind of looking at everything, not just in zoning, but how we do all of our governmental services and trying to understand why we do them and if we need to make improvements to, make those improvements. So, I look at zoning in the same way. But
I just want to jump in if it's okay with you. I mean, zoning is more than just regulation on how you can use your land. To me, it's always been a marketing tool also. I mean, if you care about seeing a certain thing happen in your community, you write it into the zoning, and that makes a predictable outcome for a lot of investors or developers. If they see that level of predictability with a predictable path forward through permitting also, then we win. Right. Plymouth is competing with a lot of other towns in this region for similar types of development.
Well, it's interesting you say that because that was a point that Lee had raised and from the select board when he talked about that very issue. He said, looking at our table of uses, that some of these uses are through special permitting process, right? It's not a by right. So some of these firms, they're spending upwards of $100,000 in engineering in hopes that they get the special permit. And if you make it by right, it becomes more predictable, as you just pointed out. So that's definitely a great point.
Yeah, and look, special permit is a very high threshold. You have to secure, 4 of the 5 votes in order to get that approved. So no one can waver on that, and that's an area of concern for a lot of developers.
So again, that's a good plug to try to push these 2 zoning articles forward. I think it's going to help, advance some of the goals of the foundation and of the town as a whole. But I want to get to something that you had attended last week or 2 weeks ago now with the select board. The foundation worked with the UMass Donahue group to conduct a economic development study. Can you talk generally about, because I know that was a very long presentation, but generally what that means to the town.
Sure, and you were very generous with your time, and so was the select board. I appreciate that. Thank you. So much more information came from that study than what was shared. One of the things that stood out to me, in fact, was that 15% of the households in Plymouth, just the town of Plymouth alone, report self-employment income. That demonstrates in some ways that this town has an innovative and entrepreneurial undercurrent. It just so happens that, in terms of the zoning articles, we want to make sure that people can run these types of businesses out of their homes, either allowed by right, but we also want to understand what they're doing in their homes so that we could create safe environments, so that if cars are queuing on the road, for example, before they turn into someone's driveway, we want to understand that. But as entrepreneurial as it was, well, let me back up. I want to give some thanks to the US EDA, the Economic Development Administration. They funded the study. That was a $200,000 competitive grant that the foundation wrote and received. UMass Donahue Institute, for our viewers' benefit, that is the state's think tank. They are the public policy think tank for the state. And they have a hell of a Rolodex. So when it comes to implementing their recommendations, they're not just going to give us a report that we look at. They're going to help us with implementation.
Okay, so then they're not leaving Plymouth technically.
Technically, no.
Good.
In fact, and I think they're one of the greatest assets in our flagship university, frankly, the UMass Donahue Institute.
And they're out of.
So they're actually celebrating their 50th celebration this year, and frankly, their headquarters is in Boston, but I'm not entirely certain whereabouts.
Yep.
But they're heavily relied on by other communities to facilitate these types of studies. And the purpose for the study was to answer just a couple of questions, well, a few questions. One, is there entrepreneurial activity in Plymouth? And the short answer we knew was yes. The second question we asked them to answer is, what are they working on? What resources are they using? And then lastly, what do they need in order to scale up?
Okay.
And it's not to say that entrepreneurial activity isn't happening in other areas. Example, healthcare and biomedical particularly. We know that that's happening. What the UMass study was going to reveal to us is what we didn't necessarily know was happening. And what they returned was a rather detailed report with a lot of great data that says that marine tech and trades is one of the few areas that we are uniquely positioned to compete in. And not only compete, but actually have some access to new markets that don't exist yet. And we can talk about what those markets might be if you'd like.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
One of them is kelp. I mean, frankly, aquaculture is something that's a growing industry. And I'll just pause here to say, too, that when you look at the coastline of New England, anything north of Quincy through Boston and the North Shore, it's fairly industrialized. In fact, one of my favorite beaches in Salem is called Dead Horse Beach. It leaves very little imagination for what that beach used to be used for, right? So while other communities like Salem, as fun as it is, they're fighting hard to recapture some of their conservation and green space in places like beaches.
Gotcha.
We don't have to do that. We want to lean into the fact that we already have coastal access and that we have a great, robust, I'd say, portfolio of good ecotourisms, tourism groups that come in here. They come just for the harvest of the cranberry bogs and to walk our trails at Miles Standish State Park. So with that said, the entrepreneurial study says that we are uniquely situated with our coastline to tap into the green-blue economy. But green-blue are just nebulous terms. And what I like about this report was they break down for us what exactly is meant. Namely, aquaculture, shellfish, and kelp, but also the robotics and the AI. In fact, I'm sure a lot of folks watching at home know already about the Mayflower autonomous ship, the Maz.
So AI stands for?
Automated intelligence.
Okay.
Yes. And I understand.
You use that acronym a lot, so I just want folks to be aware of what AI is.
No, and I appreciate you asking, because something I've had to educate myself on in working with these industries is they've gotten away from saying artificial intelligence and more autonomous intelligence, because there's still people behind the technology, and it's a little less Terminator-y. There's a little more human controls over it. But that is one of the barriers that I think that Plymouth is uniquely positioned to attract investors from, but also to help them with their PR campaign. Because one of the impediments that these industries are experiencing is public support. And so just going back to the coastline conversation, once you go south of here, you run into the issues with the National Seashore in Cape Cod. Right. And then you go further south still around the coastline, and you're in New Bedford and Fall River. The busiest port in the country is New Bedford. It's the wealthiest going on more than 20 years now. So access points in Massachusetts, and then you get into Rhode Island with their Peloponnese private estates. So when you really talk about where marine tech and trades can start and grow, we're the only place in Massachusetts and most of New England that can actually help these industries start and grow. And I'll give you one really good example. There's a company here in town called Green Sea. They launch submarines out of Cordage Park here in Plymouth. They're actually based in Vermont, but no one's launching any submarines in the Connecticut River. And so when it came to them launching their company, one of the things I find most impressive about them is the founder, Ben Kinnaman, said that, we understand more about the lunar surface than the ocean's depths. And that's why he launched his company. Just a few years later, they now have 3 companies based here in Plymouth. Not only is Green Sea launching out of here for the research and development, but Armach, which is a company that's a robotics company that cleans the undersides of ships, hulls. And then their third company is called Bayonet, which is a underwater robotic rover intended for search and rescue missions. And I understand, obviously, there's some DoD applications for this technology.
And so this is a company, Green Sea, out of Vermont.
Yep.
With no coastal line last time I checked, right?
That's right.
3 companies, they've just started here. Would you say in the last few years?
I'd say within the last 5 years.
Really?
And actually,
and they're
Bayonet's
based out of
brand
the
new.
Cordage area
right.
of town?
That's right. And Bayonet's the newest. They just announced that within the last year or so. So just providing access to the ocean helped 3 companies now start and grow.
And so what can we do? You always, every time we talk, you talk a lot about marine tech and trade and all the opportunities that we could enjoy by those types of that technology coming to here in town. How do we get them here? Like, what's the hook?
Well, the hook, I think, is our access, right? Because when you even for a company in Vermont, you might think that they would be more inclined maybe to go to New Hampshire, but New Hampshire has only 13 miles of coastline.
Right.
A company in Rhode Island might be inclined to say go to Newport, but if you've been down there, Newport is built out. One of our strategies is to work with the Naval Small Business Office. The U.S. Navy invests heavily in small businesses because small businesses can typically pivot faster. They can respond faster to problems than a large company, like, say, a Raytheon, or a Honeywell, or a Sikorsky, or a Pratt & Whitney. I can go on, but the fact of the matter is, even though we're a little bit of a liberal bastion in New England, the fact is we are the defense manufacturing belt for the nation. And one of the reports, one of the graphics that I was glad that the UMass team showed to the select board was where marine economy is happening throughout New England. And really what you see is a dominance in Massachusetts, mostly DoD stuff, but also in Rhode Island. Well, as I mentioned, Newport's kind of built out. So really so much of what our strategy is, Derek, is just making folks aware that Plymouth One exists, that we have a path forward for them for this type of a use. And I think one of the things that about this strategy that should quell a lot of the enthusiasm that we typically see for development, we don't have to cut down any trees. Plymouth usually talks about ourselves as being 101 or 103 square miles. The fact is, Wikipedia, you can check it out, it's 134 and a half square miles. That 34 and a half square miles is our bay, that's our waterways. We actually have 34 and a half million square miles that we can play with in order to develop billion-dollar industries.
Right. It's interesting because at least my first go around here, I really started to understand the aquaculture industry, and at that point it was mostly oysters, lobstermen, that type of technology. And you just mentioned something about kelp. Where do you see that going here in town?
So we do know that there's a gentleman, sugar kelp in Duxbury, that grew about 10,000 pounds in Duxbury Harbor. They were permitted by the Duxbury Conservation, among the first in Massachusetts to be permitted. So I thank the gentleman for laying the roadmap for us so we can better understand it. I think, and I want to give some merit to kelp before I get into where I think I see it coming in town, because one of the things I think lends merit to it is that they don't grow on vertical lines, and that's one of the really big impeditors to doing anything in our harbor. Vertical lines entangle whales and other floating mammals, and so we have to be mindful of that. Kelp, especially the Atlantic variety, they grow very well in shallow water because obviously the permeability of the sunlight. One of the things we know about kelp too is that it pulls, I mean, quite literally tons of carbon out of the ocean, which is the largest absorber of carbon. It helps control with erosion along coastlines because it now has a root bed. It also creates ecosystems that don't necessarily exist, small fishes and such. I think kelp beds actually could help promote a water recreation industry that we don't necessarily have here. Anybody who goes to a Caribbean nation knows that you can walk barely 5 feet down the beach before you see not only water rentals for things like jet skis, but also snorkeling, scuba diving, things of that nature. I think that we can tap into part of the marine tech economy. I think could be allowing those types of opportunities also for folks. But I think that in terms of gaining access to our waterways, that's probably the most important thing that we could do is help improve the infrastructure so that folks can not only launch things like submarines, but also gain access to things like harvesting kelp from our harbor, as well as the surrounding harbors. One of the reasons why this was particularly interesting for Plymouth is because we're the only ones with the infrastructure in place at our harbor to winch that out of the water and get it onto land so that it can be sold at market.
Well, it's interesting because it sounds like everything you said that Plymouth is primed to really be a leader in Massachusetts on some of these things. However, Plymouth actually started the oyster industry almost 20 years ago. And then Duxbury learned from the Plymouth experiment, and they quickly have overtaken the town of Plymouth when it comes to oyster harvesting. And you just mentioned that Duxbury is already starting the kelp. So how can we learn from their achievements and overtake them in the kelp industry? Is this, I mean, it sounds like Conservation Commission, they've already laid out the groundwork. So should we be working with our Conservation Commission on permitting the kelp industry here in town?
I think so, and if we're going to permit it, then I think we also as a community have to invest in the infrastructure that they're going to need, more than just winches. I mean, imagine you're pulling 10,000 pounds of kelp out of the water and you have a 500-pound capacity. You're going to be there all day.
Right.
The lobstermen and the fishermen need access to that crane too. If you had
Right.
a 1,000-pound capacity, I mean, that's barely a morning, and you free up the rest of the day for whomever else needs it. Furthermore, cold storage. Once you pull this out of the water, it has to be kept cold in order to maintain its integrity before you can get it to some kind of a shared kitchen, which is something I know you and I have talked about also. So just from allowing kelp to be grown here, that's a permitting, that's a regulatory process that the town would be responsible for, to having it hoisted from the water, to having it go through the production process with not just a cold storage, but also a shared kitchen. Every layer of production you add value.
Right.
And so just pulling it out of the water, it's just kelp. But frankly, one of the things I've come to learn is that if you turn it into a powder, it's now a supplement that produces not just protein value, but also it's what gives Beyond Burgers and Impossible Meat, it's what gives them the protein value that's greater than red meat. Furthermore, companies like L'Oreal, other healthcare beauty products, they put this type of protein in their skincare products. So it's more than just food supplements.
Right.
In fact, I understand the US EDA tells us that this could be a $15 billion industry, domestic industry by 2025. And that's
Really?
upon us. So as I'll say also, one of the things that I keep a mindfulness of is the types of crises that the state says we're up against, right? Well, the state says we're in a water crisis, and I believe them, right? We know this.
Right.
The state also says we're in a food crisis. They're trying to actively encourage more agriculture space and food growth in Massachusetts. Kelp makes a lot of sense to me because, well, if you put a farm in a piece of land, well, you're not going to put an office building there or a school or conservation space. Kelp makes sense because it grows in an area that we're currently underutilizing.
Right.
It has all those other environmental benefits, but even more, you don't pour potable water on it like you do other crops.
True.
It grows right in the salt water.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, so all we have to do is make sure that if we're going to get serious about giving Plymouth residents access to a $15 billion industry, that we have the infrastructure and the support network in place so that they can be successful, not just start.
Well, that sounds like that's going to be an opportunity for not only the foundation moving forward, and I would imagine that the next iteration of those conversations will start with the foundation. That's my guess. And then hopefully we can start to cultivate this kelp environment, which always leads us to the select board, because usually when you start to bring industry in, there's always negotiations that take place with those potential entrepreneurs. So definitely looking forward to seeing more what happens in the kelp industry and even the aquaculture in and of itself. But I know we only have a few more minutes left, and I know that we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this Blue Economy Conference. So can you talk to us about the Blue Economy Conference, what that is, when it is, and what's going to happen?
Yeah, glad to. So on October 24th and 25th, 2 half-day conferences at Hotel 1620. We're going to have a series of panels, experts in their related fields. And I also learned today that the Lieutenant Governor is coming to give our keynote speak on day 2. That's really important for us because in addition to being the Lieutenant Governor, by virtue of her role, she's also the chairperson of the Seaport Economic Council. And communities like Plymouth can really rely on that type of funding to help execute our idea and our vision. So for 2 days, we're going to lay out why Plymouth is the leader in the blue-green economy. It's called Blue Future, the now and next for Plymouth's marine economy. There are 78 communities in Massachusetts. We intend to invite representatives from the other 77 communities.
Great.
And we have excellent partnerships. And I think we have time, I'd like to thank TechEtch, Green Sea, Moonrise Cinemas, the town for your support also. We have excellent donors, including Cape Cod Community College, who just launched their associate's degree in marine economy. So this is the foundation getting ahead of the conversation and making sure that the new gubernatorial administration thinks of Plymouth when they think of how the Commonwealth's economy is going to advance, because it will be in the green-blue economies. And we give the foundation, the foundation gives the Commonwealth what that focus is for what green-blue economy can be.
Right. And it sounds to me that it's going to showcase all of the different attributes the town has to offer. And so, would we expect that we see potential entrepreneurs coming to this conference, looking around, poking around, asking questions about what Plymouth is all about?
Yeah, and actually, not only are we trying to encourage entrepreneurs for coming so they can execute their idea, we want to encourage people who want to work in the green-blue economy because there are people who are looking for jobs, but more importantly, we are in touch with the employers who are looking for the people. So if there's any one impediment, I would say, that Plymouth has to overcome, it's not even the infrastructure, that can be built. Our impediment will be building our workforce to make sure that the employees and the employers are connected. And we intend to work with our anchor partners like Cape Cod Community College, Bridgewater State. Vinny DiMacedo is an excellent ally of ours, and he's gotten us to meet, he's brought us in to meet with a number of department heads. So I think closing that gap between employers and employees is the biggest strength that we have, but it could be the biggest impediment too.
So I'm looking forward to that conference. I will be in attendance, so
Excellent.
Excited to see what happens at that and learn more about the blue economy. But we are running. We probably have a minute left, so I'm going to give you a minute to plug the Children's Business Fair.
Thank you very much. We are celebrating our 2nd annual Children's Business Fair. Last year we had 120 students participate. I'm glad to say that we have almost 300 this year. So we had to change the venue 2 times from West Elementary to Memorial Hall. And we had to change it again to Plymouth South High School.
Just because of the number of participants?
Precisely, yeah.
Wow.
We expect about 3,000 people to attend this year. We had about almost 2,000 last year, yes.
And when is that again?
So that'll be on October 20th, starting at 6 o'clock at Plymouth South High School.
Great. And so if anyone is looking for information, whether it's the Blue Economy, the Children's Business Fair, or just want to learn more about the foundation, how can they get in touch with you?
You can Google Plymouth Economic Development. We made sure our SEO is on top notch, so you'll get the first result. Or you can go to our website, plymouth-ma.biz, B-I-Z.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. So thank you for coming. We are coming to the end of this episode of This Week in Plymouth. I thank Stephen for coming on this episode, and hope to see everybody at the October 15th special town meeting on that Saturday at Plymouth North High School. But until then, thank you all, and see you soon.